as we work through the new Zoom stuff here. And then I'm quickly going to have to mute because, it's out of sync. Confused me. All right, everybody. Well, welcome to the Strand Astronomers for July. Unfortunately, you didn't have our observing session work out very well. Here, we've had a terrible run of weather. So hopefully we'll get a chance to do some observing here this fall. I certainly hope so. I know I've got to do some dialing in of my mount. That when I was out last time, I noticed the tracking is not the guiding is not working very well. So I personally need to go out and basically kind of play with the guiding and try the multi-star guiding and I was using, I think, much too long guide scope exposures. Apparently people now are using half a second or less. So I've got to try to play with some of that and see if I can get a little bit better results. I mean, I'm getting just a little bit of trailing, so that's something I've got to do. In terms of coming up, we're going to try. I'm sorry,
what are you using for auto guiding there? And how many arc seconds are you getting with your accuracy?
I'm using PH2. I'm using 120 a ZWO 120 mm.
Yeah.
On a 50 millimeter guide scope.
With PhD2.
With PhD2.
Yeah.
The problem is I'm using like 1.5 second exposures.
Yeah, I do that fine.
And it just seems like one of the settings it's on the AVX.
Yeah.
And it seems like one of the settings is not quite. It's close, but not quite right. And what I haven't done is gone and do a detailed analysis of the logs and do some testing.
Yeah. On the side there, it tells you how many arc seconds RMS you're getting in both DEC and RA.
It is, and I can't remember what the number was.
You should be getting about, with the AVX, probably about 1.5, 2 arc seconds, somewhere around there.
It just seems like it's a little out.
Yeah.
And I noticed people now are using shorter exposures and doing multi-star guiding.
Yeah.
And then I'm not sure the algorithm is the optimum one.
I can take a look at that with you.
Yeah. Next time I'm out, I like to, or next time I'm here, I can actually stream maybe.
Right. And
we're going to look at it. So we're going to try to observe again on August 3rd. So hopefully we'll get some good skies. And of course, our August indoor meeting is August 15th, right? I'm sorry, Tim, are you signaling me?
Yeah, Tim, you're on mute.
You're on mute. So I see you just gesticulating.
I'm saying there's 2 observations in August. There's one at the end of the month also. At least that's what it has on your chart.
Yes. Good catch. Yeah. Actually, the way it worked for September observing is the darkest time is really August 31st. So we've got one on August 3rd and one on August 31st. Just because the September ones did not work out very well. So we were trying to go for the dark of the moon. Thanks for pointing that out, Tim. So technically there are 2 in August. Hopefully we get at least one of them. So that would be awful nice. Yeah, so we're going to go ahead and try to do that. And of course, I'll put in a plug for Tim on the newsletter. Anybody putting articles, I know Chris, you already submitted one. Thank you for that. Anybody submitting articles for the newsletter would be greatly appreciated. Can be on any topic. You don't have to make a nice formatted article. I think
I've got 3 other articles that were sent to me by, I think they're fairly new club members.
Well, then excellent for those that send it in.
Yeah.
But I'll still encourage everyone to do that. Again, you don't have to make a nice formatted article. Tim can format it. You can just send an email with some content, and Tim will
Yep.
gladly
Or a
massage it.
website, or a website.
Or point them to a website, interesting website, sure. So yeah, just anything you find that works really well, we'd appreciate that. So if anybody doesn't have anything else, I prepared a kind of a short program. It's kind of a prototype for something, a new talk I'm doing. So, but I think it's very relevant to what's going on right now. So if anybody doesn't have anything, I'll just go through that, and hopefully it'll be relatively interesting. It's kind of tied to the news. Give me just a second here to get my screen shared. And what I thought I'd talk about is kind of a brief history of the mainly US telescope manufacturers. Obviously, in the last week, there's been a lot of telescope manufacturer news. Not all of it good for most people, but so I thought I'd kind of track some of the stuff that's been going on really in the 20th century. The telescope manufacturers have been kind of coming and going, so a lot of your favorite ones aren't around anymore or whatever. So I talk a little bit about it. It's not a complete presentation. I don't mention some of them, and I'll talk about the ones I omit because it's kind of hard to find information on everything. I've sleuthed out a bunch of information, but other information I haven't been able to find. And then also some manufacturers, I just didn't have time to really fit everything in. So, but I tried to get some of the major stuff. So let's, and I'll run up to everything that happened last week. How's that? So let's see. Yeah. Okay. So it's kind of funny, in the early 20th century, you could buy completed telescopes, but most of them were European, in fact, out of the UK. Here's 3 ads I think they're from the 1920s for telescopes from Watson and Sons, Broadhurst, Clarkson and Company, and Otway and Company rather. Now this, of course, ignores the fact of like Alvin Clark and the really high end stuff, right? I didn't really focus on the groups that were just really going for the high end telescopes, right? The real, like the professional grade, right? That's actually a whole nother presentation. But any rate, so these were examples of amateur telescopes.
I went to Broadhurst, Clarkson, Fuller's shop in London years and years, probably about, I don't know, maybe 25, 30 years ago. And they've been going since 1785.
Yeah, they're pretty long legged. But at the time in the, like in the 1920s, really in the 1930s, if you wanted an instrument in the US, you kind of bought from one of these guys. Of course, that brings us to talk a little bit about Russell Porter, right? For those of you who don't know who Russell Porter is, he moved to Vermont in 1919 to work at an optical company. He designed what's called the Porter Garden telescope. It's a really boutique-y kind of telescope, but it was kind of cool. But he got involved with the local club, which is the Springfield Club, if memory serves. And he built this clubhouse on his property called Stellafane. And that's where the Stellafane Convention, that's still held today, is held, right? He wrote a lot of articles for Scientific American that became the basis of amateur telescope making. In fact, the book, Amateur Telescope Making, the 3-volume set, is really his collected writings. He's actually a brilliant engineer. Basically really covered all the ATM principles that lasted really up through the 80s. I guess still today. Not that many people make their own. He basically, most everybody at that time, if you weren't buying from one of these overseas companies, you were grinding your own mirrors and building up your own. It's interesting because Russell Porter actually went to go to California to work on the Hale telescope at Palomar. And a lot of his designs, his drawing skills were amazing. So he did a lot of the technical drawings, but some of his design things that he did were vital to success of that instrument. So he kind of jumped from amateur to professional, but he's pretty famous and appropriately so. A few pictures. Actually, one of Russell Porter. This is from the manual, actually, for the Porter Garden telescope. I kind of grabbed a few pictures, and you can see it's kind of got the mirror and the eyepiece separate, and it's really kind of, like I said, a boutique-y one. And you can look through it, and you see various astronomical things, right? This is the company, Jones and Lamson, in Springfield, that he was working for, and it's just kind of a really neat thing. But really, starting about 1926, the first U.S. telescope manufacturer, at least the first one I can find, is called Tinsley. And it was Tinsley Telescope and Instrument. This is actually a picture of their building. You can see the 1920s vintage auto outside. This is a very early picture. They made the Saturn refractors, and these were actually amazingly good instruments. They were very quality instruments, but they were very high priced. Just for comparison, you look at the 4-inch, which is about $435. That's probably on the order of $10,000 to $12,000 today, in today's money. So, yeah, if you had a Tinsley, you had a really nice telescope. It was really high quality, but it was really sort of out of reach of the amateur. And that really was the case until the early 1940s, which is why there was so much amateur telescope making, because realistically, you had to kind of do your own thing, right? Because you just couldn't buy something off the shelf, right? Very interesting. You ever go look at Clyde Tombaugh and his biography? He actually made a telescope using a lot of old tractor parts for the mount and everything. It's one of the things that got attention for him. It got Lowell Observatory's attention of him, So it's kind of interesting. If you ever look at his original, he kept it and still used it up to the end of his life. But he did such a good job with it, and then did such careful observations with that basic instrument he created that it really got him his later job. But really, where it started to really take off was in the post-war, the 1950s, post-war through the 1950s. And this is when you see the first general U.S. telescope companies are created. And of course, they found a lot of success in the post-war boom. The economy was booming. There's also a focus on science. It was the atomic age, right? So focus on science. And you start seeing lower cost refractors start arriving. Tinsley's still in business, and Tinsley's still selling it, sort of the Teleview of its time. But lower cost refractors start arriving to try to access more of the market. But really, what you see most start coming out for cost purposes are Newtonian reflectors and equatorial mounts, and you see a lot of them. But the price is still relatively high. They're not. It's not like today where it's a relatively inexpensive process. So there's this guy in California, John Dobson, who starts exploring low-cost design for telescopes, and he'll start working on these, which will later become Dobsonians. But really, through the 1950s, he's still just experimenting with that. So some of the main companies, really, you talk about the big companies of every era. Well, and I tried to kind of capture some of that. And again, I'm sorry if I don't catch every one of your favorite ones, right? Edmund Scientific, which I'm sure has everybody heard of, or Edmund Optical, was another division when they broke up, when they kind of like divided into two divisions. It was started by this guy, Norman Edmund, in 1942, literally on a card table at his house. And then he started putting stuff in his garage and getting some other garages. He did a lot of war surplus optical assemblies. There were tons of them, not only during the war, but especially after the war. After World War II, there was this huge drawdown of the U.S. military. The size of the military had grown so large, and the war ended very abruptly. A lot of people thought it was going to go on for at least 18 months. And all the production in the U.S., the civilian production was turned over to war production. For example, you couldn't buy a car, you couldn't buy a refrigerator. They weren't made. It was not legal to manufacture those things. You had to be manufacturing, military equipment. Yep. The U.S. actually increased its military manufacturing capacity by 25 times from 1941 to like 1944. So that's much more than any other country did. And so once they started drawing down, for example, I'll give you an example. The U.S. Navy had 65,000 ships in registry at the end of the war, right? Started drawing it down. There was a lot of war surplus. And this lasted, many of you know this lasted through into the 70s and 80s. But there was a lot of optical assemblies, and he actually, Edmund actually focused a lot on the optical stuff. These weren't like completed binoculars and things like that. These were optical assemblies out of things, right? Various lenses, mirrors, or assemblies of lenses and mirrors and things like that. And he really just started acquiring tons of this stuff for virtually nothing. And people started buying this stuff because you could, the lenses, they weren't they were only in certain sizes that were used by the military. They weren't like standardized sizes, but people could use them. And his business really took off. Basically what happened is there was this inflection point with the military spending, where it went to draw down after the war. But all of a sudden the Cold War started up very quickly, and the Korean War. And of course, the military started building up again into the current military industrial complex. One of the things they did in the Korean War is they reactivated a lot of old equipment. So they had surplus a lot of spare parts, sometimes almost all the spare parts. And they went looking for that. And of course, Edmund had it. And the big joke the military made was he had more stuff than the military. So he actually started selling it back at a very good price. And that really helped him build his business. And it let him add stuff, including telescopes, to his line of optical parts. He did a lot of other things, general science stuff as well, but he added telescopes to the line of products. Here's one of them from that time frame. And you see, we are liquidating huge newly acquired stock of U.S. government telescopes, right? So this is the elbow power telescope that he'd gotten. And look at the difference, $200 value for only $12.50, right? So the basic telescopes that he started, the Spitz moon scope and things like that, and then basically pieces as well, so people could still build their own, right? So this was actually a really big deal, Edmund, in the telescope business. Another one, Cave Optical. I'm curious if anybody's ever heard of Cave. And they sold the Astrola reflecting telescopes. They're very highly respected at the time. It started by Thomas Cave and his father. They started making high quality mirrors for amateurs in 1948 in the ATM market. Their mirrors were amazingly good. And so someone suggested that they form a company, and they made Cave Wilkinson Optical. It became Cave Optical later, and a spelling error. They started making mirrors and telescopes. One interesting thing, I don't talk much about Questar because they're kind of boutiquey. Questar and Astrophysics are kind of boutiquey, so they're not really in here. But Questar wanted high quality parts. They actually went to Cave and sent them a bunch of mirrors they had that weren't ground to their specifications. And Cave actually cleaned those up and actually created the very high quality optical parts for Questar. So that's how good they were optically. So in that they basically generated, I think, pretty much most of the Questar mirrors for a long time. And this is, of course, another ad, again, right out of the time, 1950s. Criterion was another one that was started in 1954, and they introduced the Dynascope reflector. This is actually the 6-inch ad, but they started with like a 4-inch. That was about the biggest at the time. But the 6 to 8 inch is just starting to come out and be popular. But they're already seeing a lot of price pressure due to market conditions, right? With all these people jumping in, right? That means that there's more competition, so more price pressure. The other one that you see is United Scientific or United Trading, and they make Unitrons. And this was made by a guy named Lawrence Fime. He took over his dad's business in 49, but he wanted to do telescopes. And so he had purchased some of the telescopes that were out there. I mentioned inexpensive refractors were being made, but there were a lot of cheapo ones out there. I didn't put some of the really cheapo companies there that were making these basically, like crackerjack box telescopes. He found a lot of them were cheaply made and the eyepieces didn't fit. And so he was frustrated with that. He and his wife made a trip to Japan in 1951. And they actually worked a deal with Nihon Seiko for instruments, for telescope instruments. And they introduced 2 very good low-cost refractors in 1951 to compete with Tinsley. Because at the time, Japan was post-war. And basically, the yen was so weak against the dollar, he could you could get good equipment very reasonably priced. They will more than double their line of telescopes by 1954. And here's kind of a picture just of Unitron. You can kind of see, basically the fact that they weren't selling just one or two instruments. They were selling quite a bit. And they were very well, they were very well respected. You can see this kind of, this kind of setup where they had the rotating barrel and everything and on equatorial mounts, but they made very good telescopes. And these were some of the big manufacturers at the time. And the 50s did well, but of course, in the early 1960s, of course, after Sputnik, the early space race drove telescope demand even higher, right? Science was the thing, space was the thing. This is the time when the Eisenhower planetariums were all built. So, under the Eisenhower administration, they gave all this money to anybody that wanted to build a planetarium, which is why some of these, you see elementary schools of planetariums and all, and things like that. They were all built, a lot of them were built in this time frame. The competition was still high, but it was about to get higher. There were basically new designs, new technologies, and new companies going to start entering the market here. So the kind of the status of the market with the big vendors that had developed was about ready to change. But the other thing is, America in the later part of the 60s also starts changing, and astronomy has to as well. Companies needed to adapt. Some diversified, like Edmund, started making things like black lights, because, like that was the popular thing with young people. You had to have a black light and a black light poster and things like that. And near the end of the 60s, the focus on science, there wasn't so much focus on science. So they kind of had to start adapting what they did. Some will do that, some will not. But also in the 1960s, we got to introduce Tom Johnson. He was the owner of Valor Electronics in California. He started making mirrors for personal telescopes in the 1950s. So he started an astro-optical division of Valor Electronics in 1960. In 62, I found this picture. He appeared on the cover of Sky and Telescope because he brought an 18.5-inch SCT at a time when there weren't a lot of those being made. There were there were Cassegrains out there, but there weren't a lot of SCTs being made except professionally. He brought an 18.5 to a star party. And this is a picture of him at the star party with that particular telescope. Well, no surprise I'm sure everybody recognizes the name. Basically, his astro-optical division of Valor, he turned it into Celestron in 1964. Right. His real claim to fame was he had a new technique to make the Schmidt corrector plates. I won't pretend to fully understand the technique that they used, but he found one that they could economically make these Schmidt corrector plates. And if you do the SCTs, it meant the primary mirrors aren't parabolas, but they're spherical mirrors, which are very easy to create. Again, economical to create. So he was able to actually produce SCTs. They initially started with a 20 and 22-inch SCT, big ones. But by 1969, basically have a whole family of them. The 6, 8, 10, 12, and 20-inch SCTs. This is kind of a picture of them. You'll notice the color. This is before the orange. This is a picture from about that time, the late 60s, of the Celestron instruments. And you can see they're all Schmidts. There's another one called Coulter Optical. And they started Blue as well. I don't know, Blue must have been popular for his telescopes for some reason. And basically, Coulter really took the designs of John Dobson and started making these relatively inexpensive telescope. They made parts as well, but they really popularized the Dobsonian telescope. So they could offer more aperture. They made some very large ones up to like 29 or 30 inches. But they also did a lot of 8, 10s, 12s. And getting a 10 or 12-inch scope back in the 60s was a really big deal. Was not nearly as common as it was today. And so Coulter Optical started doing this. They started out Blue. They went to the signature red, I think, either in the 70s or the 80s. So by the time we get to the 1970s, the times are changing. To paraphrase Bob Dylan. The C8 is sort of the killer. Today we call something the killer app. the C8 was really the killer app for telescopes. It had a huge appeal. It was changing the market because of its portability. There were a lot more people moving from into cities, apartments, and things like that, and that they needed a more portable telescope. Plus, just a lot of people really liked the C8. One thing about the C8 or the SCT is it's good at pretty much everything, but it's not great, absolutely great at any one thing, right? But it was a really good telescope. And basically the market just really sucked it up at a time when everything was Newtonian. It held collimation a lot better. Instead of having to collimate every time. So it was basically going great guns. The traditional companies are suffering a loss of market share, not only because of like the C8, but also because of costs. A lot of them were not keeping pace with either technology or what people wanted, or manufacturing improvements to improve their cost. Cave was actually sold in 1979. The new owners actually didn't wait very long, and they actually liquidated it. Criterion tried to make an SCT, and with all due respect, it was pretty much a disaster. It was not well made, and the fork mount they had was very, very shaky. And it was basically considered to be it was considered to be a really poor telescope, which pretty much will do them in. There's some ads from the 1970s, and you can see this one with Dynamax 8. This is Criterion. This is trying to make their SCT, and again, it was not very successful. Here's the last of the Cave Astrolas. So there were here's Edmund Scientific. Edmund Scientific, still in the business, basically still sticking with a lot of really basic reflectors at a reasonable price. Of course, the 1970s is also known for two classic moves in telescopes, right? First is orange tubes. Celestron picked the orange, the classic orange. They decided to introduce this. Not sure why they did it, but it was actually a really great move because it's a super signature thing for them. Still today, not as much, but still, The other thing was Edmund Scientific was trying to figure out what they wanted to do. And Edmund Scientific has always been really good about trying to, stay up and regenerate their product line. They did a lot more than just telescopes. They sold a lot of scientific equipment. In fact, in the 70s, if you wanted to buy something, I think it was Neil deGrasse Tyson that made the comment that Edmund was like, it was a scientific paradise because at a time when no one had lasers, you could buy one from Edmund Scientific, But they wanted to create a telescope that was simple to use, that was very maintainable, and that basically looked like it belonged in a 1970s living room. And that's a direct quote from them. So they made the Astroscan. I don't know how many people remember the Astroscan. But the idea, it's on a little stand here. The idea is you can sit in your lap and you could just look at anything. It's like, I think it's like a 4.25 inch reflector. Obviously very short focal length, but it sold relatively cheaply and it was very easy to use. And this scope was manufactured all the way up through into the 2000s. So it was very popular. The other thing that happened in the 70s, of course, is Meade telescopes. John Dybel started Meade in 1972. He's an interesting guy. His goal was not only to create a successful telescope company, but to be the biggest telescope company ever. He was very keen on that. He cut a deal with Cave Optical to sell them his imported telescope parts. Meade started, they didn't manufacture anything. They actually brought stuff in again from Japan because things were there was still very favorable trade balance there. This is some of the examples of the early ones. You see, this is from Sky Intel 1974 of things they had. But he cut a deal with Cave Optical to sell them imported telescope parts at a cheaper price. Cave was already suffering, and he said, "Look, I can get you some of these parts cheaper." Straight from Japan, right? And he started selling it. It turns out that he and Cave actually became really good friends. And and had a very friendship and very close working relationship. However, we already know that Cave was going to go out in 1979. So as Cave started to have economic trouble, they decided to cut out Meade and go straight to Japan. And the shame was this actually destroyed the friendship between Diebel and Cave until the end of their lives. So it really just embittered both of them. So again, Meade started first with Japanese refractor, and then a little bit later started making Newtonian reflectors. Right. So also, still shortly after that, there's Orion telescopes. You can kind of see we're already in the zone of like the 60s and the 70s. We're moving from that first gen of telescope makers to the new guys, the new crew. Tim Geisler founded it in 1975. It really operates as Optronic Technologies, and you'll see that. It is employee owned. It had a storefront and mail order business. This is a picture. This is probably from the early 80s. But again, a lot of things they made are like the Dobbs and everything. So they made very cost effective Dobbs, actually, that were good quality. So you can see this is really starting in the 1980s. I picked a few ads. You can see Meade, some of the stuff they were selling. From 1980, you see here's the Coulter, Odyssey, still in business, doing the thing. And of course, Celestron, again, it's always pretty good at their ads, right? So they got Leonard Nimoy to, they got Spock power to, advertise their telescope. So they always were pretty good at that. They'll continue doing that, like when they give one to Stephen Hawking and gave one to Stephen Hawking, helped him set it up. They tend to be pretty good at that. But it's really the changing of the guard starting in the early 1980s. We'll go through that. Yeah, Unitron or United Trading got bought by Nikon. Unfortunately for Nikon, they got the rights to rebrand the very bad Dynamax, that SCT that wasn't very good. It still exists, but the division was taken private in 1986. And even by like in the 1980s, like 95, 96% of their business was purely in microscopes. So really the Unitron telescopes really just sort of disappear. Really after the 80s, you just don't see anything about it. And most of the people that work there weren't working there anymore. It got laid off. So sort of just kind of faded away. Criterion got bought by Bushnell. Bushnell about 1982, Bushnell had been bought by Bausch and Lomb, I think back in the like 1977 or what 77 or so. Again, after a little while, they just sort of go away. They quietly close the business. So basically, they just disappear. You may wonder about Tinsley from the 20s. They're actually still around today. They slowly started migrating as the market got more competitive to precision optical projects for like the military and government. It still operates today as TIOS. I think it's Tinsley Instrument and Optical Solutions, I think. But again, it works on primarily professional and really super high-end projects. As an example, they actually were called in to create optics to fix the Hubble Space Telescope, right? So they're pretty big, they're very well respected. But again, they don't make any kind of amateur instruments anymore. Well, the 1980s brings a lot more changes. Meade decides to enter the SCT business. They've seen Celestron really knocking the cover off the ball. And so they basically do this. It's about the same time that Celestron was sold. Tom Johnson decided to get out and he sold Celestron. So Meade thought it was a pretty good time. At the same time, another big future player, Cinta Technology Corporation, is formed in Taiwan. That will actually dovetail into our story in a few minutes. So in 1984, for some reason, Celestron switches back to the black tube color. This is actually the one I've got is the black tube. So I'm not sure why they did, but they decided to switch to that nice black tube color. The other thing that's starting to make changes is going to put a lot of pressure on the market is go-to technology starts appearing. And it changes what the market expects. There's still a lot of holdouts in the market that didn't want go-to or thought you shouldn't buy a go-to telescope. I remember hearing that a lot many years ago about how you shouldn't buy a go-to scope. You should learn the sky. But go-to really, on the other hand, really opened up astronomy to a lot of people who had less time to actually, learn the entire sky and star hop. Still better if you learn to star hop, but It's sort of akin to the amateur radio, where when they got rid of the code, the Morse code requirement for the licenses, right? There was a lot of argument about that, but the argument is there's a lower barrier of entry to get people in, right? Still should learn Morse code. So that brings a lot of challenges. So now, rather than talk about different decades, I'll talk about the modern era and basically what's kind of been going on in the telescope. And we're sort of hitting this. We had the big four that we talked about in post-war, and then sort of got all these new big players in the modern era. But all of a sudden, we're sort of at another one of these inflection points, and there's been a lot of changes, right? And things are kind of switching over, right? So like 1990, things like Celestron still introducing stuff like FASTAR for photography. 92, the Celestron rides in the space shuttle. 20 years later, they'll install a Celestron 9.25 on the International Space Station. Still getting a lot of good press. They're really good at that. Meade will actually start manufacturing in the 90s in Irvine, California. So instead of just bringing an imported instrument, they'll start manufacturing their own stuff. Celestron will hit some trouble in 1997. Tasco buys them. They're still selling a lot of telescopes. It's attractive for Tasco because Celestron's still selling a lot of scopes. Like this is the era when they're rebranding Losmandy mounts as one of their mounts, right? The CG11, for example. I've got one of those. Still got the Celestron branding on it, but it's purely a Losmandy mount from Hollywood General Machining. Unfortunately for Tasco, they're not selling a lot of other stuff or a very good margin, a very good profit margin. Celestron's doing well, but not Tasco. In 1999, Cinta starts a Skywatcher brand for non-US markets. They actually headquarter it in Vancouver, and they make it for Canada and Europe and a bunch of markets, but it's not in the US because they're actually making a lot of components and assemblies for Orion and some other telescope manufacturers as well. But primarily Orion, they're making equipment for Orion. I should mention Cinta actually does this thing that's going to matter later on, is they're a Taiwan company, but they actually open there's like a sister Chinese company where they move a lot of their manufacturing to. It's like Shuzhou Optical. And again, that'll matter in a few minutes what that means. Well, a mere 4 years after Tasco bought Celestron, Tasco folds. And the whole company just sort of kind of implodes. This makes it very interesting for Celestron because this is the one part of Tasco that's still selling a lot of product because they never rebranded as Tasco. They always were Celestron. They still have the name, power in that brand name, still selling a lot of product, still very well respected. It's a valuable part of Tasco. And that kind of creates a big shakeup, right? Because now a lot of people want to try to grab Celestron. The biggest one that want to try to grab it is Meade. And basically, Meade tried to acquire it over 2001, 2002. It turns out there was a court battle over it, and the FTC got involved because one of the concerns is if Meade buys Celestron, they're going to own like a lot of the telescope market, right? And become a virtual monopoly. Because at the same time, the original owners were trying to buy back Celestron. So there's this big court battle, big expensive court battle, a lot of drama. What happens is Meade basically loses. And basically it goes back to the original owners. And this is actually going to be this is part of this soap opera that's going to wrap up, probably wrap up mostly this week or last week and this week. They only last for a couple of years. In 2005, Cinta, I spelled it wrong here, sorry. The Taiwan company acquires Celestron. And also at that same time, Imaginova, which you probably never heard of. It's like a holding company that started by Lou Dobbs, the CNN guy, acquires Orion. And about the same time, a new company pops out, Explore Scientific. This is some ex-Meade people. And it's in conjunction with Jinghua Optics of China. Of course, they're still around today. They make very good quality instruments, right? A lot of people really like their refractors. About 2009, Meade's still suffering a lot of financial pressure, and he moves all its manufacturing to Tijuana, Mexico, out of Irvine, California. This is about the time that part of the pressure is coming from Skywatcher, which starts selling in the U.S. market. All of a sudden, Skywatcher scopes. In 2011, Shuzhou ZWO is formed. Of course, we all know them for making cameras, but they're also making a lot of optical instruments now. So they'll be a big player about 10 years after, they were originally formed, when they start getting into the telescope business. Meade still had a lot of problems. So in 2013, it merges with Sunny Ningbo, or Ningbo Sunny, depending on if you use the Asian order or the English order, the Western order rather, of the name, from China. So about the same time, Explore Scientific became completely U.S. owned. It was purchased by Journey North Inc. And the next one I called The Fate of the Furious. So what happened next? I call it Furious because Meade was always wanted to be, the biggest guy. So in 2019, Optronic Orion filed a lawsuit against Cinta and Sunny Ningbo, because between the two of these companies, the Meade and the Celestron and Orion, they made about 80% of the telescopes sold. That's probably conservative. They maybe even made more. So basically what they accused Cinta of doing was, when they couldn't, they accused Cinta of funding Sunny Ningbo to acquire Meade. Basically, they gave them the money to buy Meade, and then subsequently they worked together with Sunny Ningbo to fix prices to beat the antitrust laws. So basically, everybody paid more for telescopes. That was the basis of the lawsuit. It's a little hard to tell all the details about this, depending on who you read and what stuff you read, but it appears Cinta settled with Orion pretty quickly, and for like $500,000 or something in direct payment. What it seems like, Cinta was dissolved in Taiwan like immediately after that, because it still had Suzhou Cinta of China, the manufacturing arm, and that's who does the Cinta stuff and operates under the Cinta name today. Sunny Ningbo decided they weren't going to go down they were going to go down swinging. And so they went to court and lost big time. A $16.8 million settlement. Unfortunately, I don't think Orion, I don't know if Orion saw a dime of that money. Meade immediately declared bankruptcy. And basically what Orion got out of that lawsuit was they acquired Meade. And so Orion Telescopes then acquired all the Meade stuff. Unfortunately, again, they didn't get very much. As of 2024, actually last week, Optronics has ceased operation, both Orion and Meade. They've laid off all their personnel. They closed all their storefronts, closed all their offices. It's a little unclear exactly what's going on, if they're going to seek. I don't think they're going to seek any bankruptcy protection, because they actually laid off all the employees. So I noticed someone earlier talking about trying to get Meade on the phone. There's going to be a big problem with getting Meade on the phone, since they're basically non-existent at this point. This includes the manufacturing facility in Tijuana. So it's a little unclear what's going to happen at this point with any related assets for either Orion or Meade. Their websites are still up, by the way, and theoretically taking orders. But we've seen this before with zombie websites, like when OPT went out of business or any of these things. There are zombie websites that aren't updated because no one's working there. So it's paid to update the websites. So, I would caution anybody against putting any orders in for either of these companies, because they certainly don't have to fulfill the orders. So, that's a pretty big shakeup in the telescope market. And ironically, Celestron is, kind of going great guns when it looked like, these guys really were going to put Celestron out of business, but all of a sudden Celestron seems to be going great guns. Some honorable mention people I didn't talk about are some of the Dob manufacturers, like Obsession, no longer taking orders, or Rob Teeter Telescopes. He's a real nice guy. He's no longer taking new orders. They didn't talk much about Questar, it's kind of boutiquey. They didn't talk much about Astrophysics, because again, kind of boutiquey. The future. What happens in the future? Well, again, not only we have all this churn, but part of it is there's kind of another sea change coming. We're starting to see smart telescopes appearing, as are new companies, right? Um, the Celestial Origin is one smart telescope. It's a higher end one, like 3000, but they have cameras built in. You control them from a smartphone or a tablet. Of course, the probably the biggest one is the ZWO Star S50, which has been huge and taken a lot of the amateur astronomer community by storm. But the Dwarf company makes dwarf telescopes. They also makes these automated small portable telescopes. Same thing with Vespera. So it looks like we're starting to get another group of companies starting to do this. So it's just kind of interesting. This again, I put this together just because I was kind of curious when I was following all the news last week about Meade and Orion. Just a shame because I really liked Orion. Kind of was trying to figure out. I started doing a little research about how we got where we got, and it sort of like led me down this path. So that's really it. I know I was interested, and I hope everybody else is reasonably interested in the story of how we got where it is. Whether your favorite telescope company made it or not, I don't know, or any of the stuff you may have seen when you were younger. But that's kind of where things are lying right now. So
What are
it's
they going to do about spare parts for people who already own those telescopes?
well, right now they've shut down all their operations,
Wow.
everything. They shut down all the facilities and they laid off all the employees, according to Sky and Tel. This is different than a chapter like just trying to declare bankruptcy and reorganizing. They have basically stopped. So what happens with what happens with all the components that are there and the designs? It's going to be up to the probably the courts to handle. Much like when OPT went out of business. When OPT went out of business, what happened is the courts basically hired somebody to auction off their inventory. They had huge inventory, and individuals could bid on it as well, right? And they basically said, "Hey, on these 3 or 4 days, you're going to be able to bid on it." And they had all these different lots that you could bid on, all the equipment. And I think Agena Astro got basically a lot of the rights to the contact list of the business and things like that, right? So probably if they really have, and again, it's a little unclear. It's not like you just call them, but it's a little unclear. If they really have done that, then the courts will probably decide where the assets go, and then what will happen is any creditors, including anybody that put an order in that hasn't gotten anything, will have to stand in line, and they'll probably try to sell off all the assets, and you just start paying back the creditors. That's usually what happens. But it depends. They may owe huge bills to suppliers that or if they have preferred stock. If any of those companies have preferred stock shareholders, they get paid off first. Common stock shareholders get paid off next. It's a process, and no one really knows. It is though highly unusual that they just didn't declare bankruptcy or file, like Chapter 11 or Chapter 7. At least I haven't checked today if they have. They basically shut down.
Tony, if you're worried about your mount, yours is made by a Skywatcher anyway, or Center. So, and a lot of Orion mounts are.
Yeah.
Right.
I was just asking that question.
Right. Well, and that's a very good question. It's an opportunity for Cinta to basically, like I said, Cinta's Skywatcher, so they may start selling components, or they may make a claim. They got a claim. They may say, "Give us parts," or I don't know. It's always tough when there's an abrupt transition like this.
Your control module for your Orion, Tom, I got that from the UK, from Skywatcher.
Yeah.
It's an opportunity for it's going to be an opportunity for some of those companies to again just enhance what they sell, right? So yeah, again, it's all kind of very up in the air. Um, but it seems to be confirmed that basically they let everybody go, which is never a good sign.
I used to love Meade telescopes, and I had poor customer service from them quite a while ago, probably about 10, 15 years ago. And then when I was trying to help Tim with his, I had bad customer service experience with Orion as well. I didn't think they were particularly good. With Celestron are fantastic when you deal with them.
Well, I think a lot of that probably has to do with the health of the company too, right? As they started really getting ground, both Orion and Meade, really cut back. They were not very financially stable. So I think that makes a difference. And
The
that's why there's like for Meads, I know there's this fellow in New Jersey that repairs them, has a lot of components. Um, you know, I can't remember his exact name, Tony something or other. Actually has a business where he repairs a lot of the Mead stuff.
Ed, so my experience with Meade when I was in the Middle East, they won't sell out of market. So if you're in the UK, Meade USA won't sell you any products. You have to go to Meade UK, right?
Right.
And I'd reverse the polarity on an input on the LX90, and their regional offices were in Saudi Arabia, and the Saudis just wouldn't deal with me. They weren't interested. And I contacted Mead USA, and they wouldn't deal with me. They said, "No, you've got to go back to Saudi." And I said, "But they won't deal with me," and they just left me in a loop. So eventually, I got a friend of mine was traveling to South Africa, and I got him to go into Mead in South Africa. I phoned the guys in South Africa. They said, "We can't ship it to you. If you can get somebody to come in, we'll give you the part." So I got a buddy fly down there, and he collected the part for me, and I fixed it.
Yeah. So
But there's another telescope company that's still doing pretty well, and that's Orion UK. They're no relationship to Orion at all, and you can buy really high quality mirrors from them as well.
yeah, I didn't again, I kind of put this together just based on some of my research. I'd like to build it into a bigger one. I didn't really cover some of those other ones. I didn't cover Vixen out of Japan and some
Yeah.
of the ones like that. I kind of just wanted to focus a little bit on some of the US ones just for time and run time of the presentation. Yeah, there are numerous companies like that. There's a lot of smaller ones too. Um, but it's really just very interesting um, that I was a little surprised to see. I know Mead was having trouble. But I guess that is Orion. But I was a little surprised to see Orion go down because I thought they still had good. I thought they still had a decent. I thought they had too many products. It wouldn't surprise me if they had just kind of trimmed their line back a little bit, but apparently that's not what happened. So, uh, and it's again, it's kind of interesting that they didn't pursue bankruptcy protection, that they just basically let everybody go.
They could be in negotiations with somebody. Declaring bankruptcy might affect the commercials on it.
Could be, whoever owns the assets and the rights to the name may be negotiating with somebody that would recreate that. But again, you're right. It's pure guesswork at this point, and everybody's trying to, this news is only like 6 days old, right? Um, so you know, don't really don't really know what's going to happen with those, right? So, but it's always interesting. That also, of course, means Coronado. That's the other thing Mead was doing. That's the brand also that goes down as well, right? Again, I didn't
Well,
focus
that's
on
the solar telescopes.
that solar
That was the
telescope.
solar. Oh, yeah.
Um,
Well, that stinks.
so, and again, I don't know what's going to become of that, and it's kind of a boon for Lunt, um, their main competitor. But it's just really it's pretty interesting um, in terms of kind of a changing of the guard, right? You know, who knows whether Meade's going to be gone, or Orion's going to be gone, or whether they'll be, if they're reconstituted, I suspect they'll be reconstituted in a much smaller form, without a lot of the peripheral products that they made, because I think they were doing a little too much. So
Yeah, I'm surprised because the Orion XT8 is like the standard for amateur astronomers, you know.
the Dobbs were, but the problem, I think, and again, I'm guessing. Okay, I'm not an expert, although I do play one on Zoom. Is that you know, they tried to do a lot of the inexpensive refractors and everything. And the
Yeah.
problem is, right now, if you're going to buy a refractor, Orion would not be the person you'd go to, or Meade. You know, there are so many good refractors out there, even the inexpensive ones, even the acromats. There's some really good ones out there. And, you know, they had a lot of those type things. I think the standout product for Orion was the Dobbs.
Mhm.
But I don't know, that might not have been enough to carry them. I mean, they had a lot of other stuff. And I think they had a lot of other stuff, but I think it aged out, right? Like you could buy filters, and you got a lot of small stuff from filters from and everything, right? But the thing about it is they tried to make some of the things like the Star Shoot, the camera things and everything, and they just didn't. I mean, I don't think that stuff went, right? So it may have been they were just carrying too much. And Meade had its share of problems too. I'm not sure if they ever rationalized the product lines between Orion and Meade. When you go down in a couple of years like that, that probably means you did. Probably means you're still trying to do everything, right? So whatever happened, apparently it's pretty drastic. Plus, supply chain problems have been very difficult since COVID, during COVID and since COVID. And it may have made it pretty difficult on both those companies.
Out of curiosity, so what's the relationship between Celestron and Skywatcher? Because
Well,
I recently had it was an EQ M35 control box go, and I ended up dealing with Celestron with it directly, and they supplied the component.
well, I think I think they are both owned by Cinta, or whether it's Cinta Suzu, it doesn't really matter.
They just put a different label on it, that's all.
You know,
When I spoke to the rep, he said send it to the following address, and it was a Celestron address. And I said, well, aren't you guys competitors? He said, no, we deal with Skywatch. And I thought, oh, that's odd. I didn't know they had any relationship at all.
yeah, well, they both trace back to the same ownership. So you know, the same company owns both brands. They just make a little bit different product lines, right? So I think there's a lot of common technology. Cinta seems to have weathered that a little bit better and been pretty good about optimizing stuff and not doing too much.
Their mounts are really good.
Their mounts are really good. They seem to rationalize their product lines pretty well in terms of what they carry and not carrying too much of, you know, they seem to be focusing pretty much on the core business and what sells. You know, so again, that's just kind of my personal opinion, but they seem to have done a really good job. Celestron is doing pretty well.
You know, when I needed a new mount, Chris kind of helped me find one, and we weren't sure if it would work with my Celestron setup. So I called Skywatcher, and they said, we don't know nothing about Celestron. Don't even ask a question. So okay, I called Celestron up, and it says they're the same company that makes our tripod. So don't worry about it. So we can't guarantee it'll work, but I think it will. So they gave out more information than the Skywatcher people did.
So it wasn't Skywatcher, it was Orion, because your box was Orion. When we contacted them, they said, well, sorry, we don't support that anymore. Your
Yeah,
original box is marked Orion, and eventually I ended up contacting. It was a company in Germany. The only place I could find that advertised them for sale was in Germany, and I
that was a
contacted them,
box.
and they said, "Yeah, it'll work."
Yeah.
But they had a lead time of about 3-4 months or something. So I found another one on a supply with I think it was Greenwich Astronomers in the UK, and I contacted them, and they wouldn't ship it to me. So I got my son in Britain. I got it delivered to him, and then he shipped it over to us so that we could get yours fixed.
Yep.
Yeah, I
That's-
think, a lot of the original stuff from Orion was made by Cinta.
Yeah.
Once the lawsuit happened, I suspect that relationship got pretty poisoned. That's a guess. On top of that, Orion had a policy that they implemented. I don't know when they implemented. It's been in place for a couple of years. That they didn't support products. They only supported the original purchaser. So in other words, if you bought a used mount, they could just say, we're not going to support you.
Yeah.
So
Which is pretty poor customer service, right? You're not going to
yeah,
want to go back to them for business again, are you?
that was there was a lot of angst on cloudy nights about that. About that particular strategy, right? Because nobody else follows that strategy.
Yeah.
It's one thing to say, hey, if it's out of warranty, you have to pay for service, or after a certain period of time, we no longer support that product, period. That's one thing, right? But that whole original purchaser thing, I think, was a little.
It makes your
Yep.
product unsellable. So you're not going to buy something if you can't sell it on.
Right. I never really actually kind of understood that particular approach, but yeah, so it's very interesting. I'm not trying to trash any particular company. I mean, obviously, we respect all the companies, and certainly would like to see all the former companies in business. Like I said, I did like Orion. I bought stuff from Orion quite a bit, and but it is sort of the way things are going now, right? So, and we are seeing some of these new companies like ZWO making big inroads into optical instruments and mounts. And so it looks like we're, kind of changing the guard over to a new generation. So right now, and these automate.
Sorry, go.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'd love to try one of those strain wave mounts that ZWO are making.
Yeah, I don't know. A couple of guys in my old club have them. I'll have to ask what experience they have.
The auto guiding's down to like 0.5 arc seconds with those things.
Yeah, again, I just don't know anybody that actually has used them in imaging. So I don't know. It's interesting, right? Because it could really impact the mount market.
Well, there's a few people starting to produce strain waves now, aren't there?
Yeah, it's not just it's not just Ioptron, right? Which I didn't mention Ioptron. I probably should put them in the presentation too. I think ZWO has one as well. And I think there's another manufacturer that was talking about them as well.
I think Skywatcher brought one out.
Skywatcher, I think. Yeah. So that's Cinta. So, I mean, that's a pretty good indication that they think that's a technology that's going to go. So, it's kind of interesting.
You don't get backlash for them.
Yeah, which would be really nice because I think that's part of my problem on my AVX. I think I've got a lot of backlash.
Yeah. I sent my AVX in. They do that mod, Orange, I think it's Orange County something or other in
Orange
California.
County, yeah.
I sent mine off so that it could replace the bearings. It improved it, but probably by about half a degree. So I got it down from about 1.5 down to sort of somewhere between 0.8 and 1 now. So that's all right. No, not as good as I've got an EQ6 and I'm getting down to about 0.6, 0.5 with that.
Sure. The AVX, I love my AVX, don't get me wrong. It's a great portable grab and go mount. You just can't ask too much of it.
Yeah.
But for the cost, it's a great grab and go mount. So easy to set up and reasonably good. For astrophotography. I mean, for obviously for visual, it's great. And for some astrophotography, it's great, but you just can't ask too much of it. You got to jump up to the next level mounts. Like you said, the EQ6, great mount. I've got a CGX too that again is just capable of doing so much more.
Yeah.
So
sorry, go.
no, go ahead.
The EQ6, I was getting about 1 arc second with that, and I converted it into a belt drive. I've got that down to 0.5 now. Took the gears out, the belt drive in them.
A lot of people have done that mod and feel that it does a great job.
Yep.
So you basically, that's most everybody that I know that has an EQ6 has done the belt drive mod. So which is really nice. That's why I like the CGX head belt drive. It's hoping to get a little bit better performance. That's another one. I need to bring both out and do some characterization of them. I need to spend a night. I need a mediocre night where I can just start and actually just spend the whole time just looking at some graphs and not trying to capture images. So,
well, moon's a great time for that, and we always seem to get clear skies at full moon.
Yeah, unfortunately, I've been having been out of the country and a lot of other things. I haven't been able to do any of that. Right. Yeah, unfortunately, for some reason, if you're a lunar observer, yeah, it's been great down here this summer. But if you're a deep sky, no, not so much. So it's a shame because when we have, good conditions, last time I was at Hampton, I tried to take some images, but again, I was suffering some guiding problems, which was a shame. I really just need to concentrate on. I need to spend some time looking at the PhD2 setup, the algorithms and the settings, and you can get the PhD log viewer code that lets you kind of view the logs and analyze the logs a little bit. And I need to do some of that, actually figure out what's going on.
If you so you're using a polar scope on that, right?
I use SharpCap
Okay.
Pro to line it up, and I had pretty good polar alignment.
All right.
Again, the trailing was not horrible, but you obviously want round stars. But it was my Tele 85, so I was only imaging at like 480 millimeters. So, but I was seeing some trailing when I did a close up look at the stars.
Yeah.
So I, again, am not sure exactly what's going on. I wonder if it is partly the backlash. But again, I need to look at the guiding graphs and see what's going on.
I think PhD, you can adjust the backlash on that, can't you?
Yeah, and it's got several algorithms for the way it adjusts it, like predictive PEC and things like that.
Yeah, I've used that. It's brilliant.
I don't think I have that turned on, so I need to do, because I've moved my computer a couple of times. So I'm wondering if I need to reconfigure the settings a bit. There's some. I pulled off some of the settings, the recommended settings for AVXs from Cloudy Nights. I just haven't had a chance to actually configure them yet and give it a try.
Yeah.
I need to run just a series of tests where I'm just taking some images, stars, and see if I can get the guiding knocked out. The autofocusing works like a champ now. That's working great. Yes, Ronnie, what's up?
I got a question. I know at one time that Hampton Plantation was gonna make a place for us to go, anytime we wanted to. That anything ever come of that?
Yeah. So that is not something they're going to decide to pursue, right? The reason they pursued that was to try to get IDA certification. And I guess the state just has decided they don't want to spend the money to do that. So we are able to use Hampton Plantation, and we don't have to stick to just our monthly observing dates. we can also call them if we want to go out. If we're getting a really fantastic night, we can call them and go out. But that clearing that area, the tree stand area, is not going to be a go forward plan. So it's a shame, but again, we'll try to, again, if we get a really good night, we can easily schedule something out there. So they're pretty flexible. The good news for Hampton is both of the rangers live on site. So it's not a case of like they can't go home. So, so that's fortunate that it's set up that way. Any other questions before we stop the streaming?
Well,
All right. Well, thanks everybody that's watching or will be watching.